Good afternoon and welcome to the Debut Spotlight. My name is Ellen Comisar and I am here today with K.E. Semmel. Oops, have his book upside down, not so good. The author of the Book of Losman, which just came out yesterday. I am delighted to have K.E. Semmel with us, and we will have a great conversation coming up shortly. But first, a little bit of information and housekeeping. We are a Mighty Blaze. For those of you who are longtime members of Blaze Nation, welcome back. We're delighted to have you again. For those of you who are new to the Blaze, welcome to us for your first time. We are a group of 30 or so creative professionals who got started at the beginning of COVID to make sure that authors connected to their readers and readers connected to their authors. Here we are 4+ years since the onset of COVID, and we are still going strong, and we have no intention of ever stopping. Our website is amightyblaze.com. And if you go to that website, you can subscribe to our newsletter where you will get via email a wonderful listing of all of our upcoming programs, as well as links to some of our past programs and our podcast. Our programs live forever on YouTube. And as you probably know, we are ubiquitous, I can't speak today, on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and we are delighted to share not only news about our shows and authors, but also news of importance in the literary world and in the world at large. So thank you and welcome, Kyle.
Thank you for having me, Ellen.
So Kyle's the Book of Losman came out this week. It has been called a fine and funny novel by Owen King, author of The Curator. It's a book that asks important questions about memory, identity, and the things we choose from our personal histories to build our fractured selves, says Rian Amilcar Scott, who wrote The World Doesn't Require You. And Jeff Grazer, a mutual friend, wrote for Heavy Feather Review. Semmel's penetrating and well-researched insights in the Book of Losman have provided a tender, poetic, and thought-provoking book. The book is also imaginative, riveting, moving, and occasionally absurd, says Eden Lepucki, author of Time's Mouth, and explores how badly we want to use the past to help solve our present. So I welcome Kyle, and I will give him a little bit of our readers a little bit of his official bio, and then we can launch into questions. K.E. Semmel is a writer and translator. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in the Ontario Review, Lit Hub, the Writers Chronicle, the Southern Review, the Washington Post, and among other places. He has translated several novels by a number of authors whose names I cannot pronounce, and I will let him talk to that. He is also a former literary translation fellow from the National Endowment for the Arts. He lives in Scottsville, New York, just outside Rochester, New York, with his wife and his son. So welcome, Kyle.
Thank you again.
And I think before we start, we should get too deep into it. We should explain why I'm going to call you Kyle, and your book has you as K.E. Semmel.
Yeah. So the name Kyle has always bothered me a bit. I've never been a fan of it for reasons that are possibly ridiculous, but I just didn't really care for it as a kid. And I would tell my mother, for example, that I wanted to be my middle name. And when she told me that they would call me by my middle name, I realized I didn't like that either. So when I was in Denmark, I used to live in Denmark. And while I was there, I came upon the work of a philosopher named K.E. Løgstrup. And I realized that K.E. worked perfectly. My middle name begins with E, and K.E. Løgstrup sounded awesome. And the name K.E. sounded cool. And so I went with it. You know, the other benefit was that I was writing a lot more experimentally back in those days. And I thought it'd be cool to not have a gender, so to speak, where I could write however I wished and not worry about whether or not, I was seen as a male or female author.
Great. So tell us a little bit about the Book of Losman, which, as you lived in Denmark, so does our protagonist, and as you are a translator, so is our protagonist. But that is where the facts collide, and then the fiction takes off. So tell us a little bit about.
Yeah. So the Book of Losman is about a literary translator in Copenhagen who has Tourette Syndrome, and he gets involved in a dubious drug trial that claims to be able to get to the bottom of his Tourette and possibly relieve him of his Tourette syndrome.
And what we find is a protagonist who's living a fairly isolated life in a very beautiful city and has encounters with a number of very quirky people, not only the scientists who he meets who allege that they can cure his Tourette, but also just sort of his neighbors and all these people who sort of flow into the book. Did you have all those characters in mind as you started? Because many of them are very well developed and somewhat ancillary at the time we meet them.
So I wrote the Book of Losman at a time when I was working as the executive director of a nonprofit here in Rochester. It was a stressful time, and it was writing the Book of Losman helped me kind of get away from that stress. And I was working, I would get up at 5 a.m. and I would write on it. I would write on the book. I have written a number of manuscripts over the years, none of which ended up being published, but all of which involved a great deal of research. And for this particular one, I wanted a straight up story. I wanted something that I didn't feel I had to do a lot of research for. And so because I lived in Denmark, because I have experience as a literary translator, and because I've had these tics all my life, or most of my life, I thought, you know what, I could tell this story and do so and just propel the narrative forward without worrying about having to stop and think about, research. And so the characters themselves are obviously fiction, but they form a part of how do I say this? My world. They, as with most writers, there are some composite elements of the characters that from people or situations from my own life or lives of others. And in addition to that, the opening scene, as an example, Kramer, one of the characters in that book, is actually a character in a story by Simon Frulund. And from this book, Milk and Other Stories. Simon's work has always been, I discovered about 15 years ago before I even started translating. Actually, it's about 20 years ago now. And I just loved it. And I started translating this book. It was the first thing I ever started to translate. And Kramer was one of those stories. And it was such a vivid story that it just stuck with me. And when I was looking and working on Losman and looking at ways to develop the story, I thought, how amazing would it be for a literary translator to kind of journey along the same path that I, as a translator, journeyed. And so that's where some of these characters came about. Caroline Jensen is the kind of love interest in the Book of Losman, and she has her beginnings in another story by Simon Frulund called Crossings, which is also in this book. So yeah, I just had a lot of fun with it, to be honest. And Simon gave me permission. He actually really enjoyed the way I kind of blended in his fiction in the narrative. He read the book, gave me great feedback. So yeah, that's essentially how these characters came about.
So when the book starts, we have Losman in his apartment, and there's a thud upstairs, and nobody quite knows what's going on. And they discover that this Kramer character seems to have fallen in his apartment, and this neighbor, Carolina, who becomes the love interest, has called on Losman to come help her, deal with what turns out to be, and I'm not giving anything away, Kramer is dead, as the section title shares with us.
You learn that in the first 3 words of the book. Kramer is dead.
Kramer is dead. So right away, you don't know who he is, you don't know anything about him. And that's part of the mystery as well, of who was this character and why don't we know his background. And I think to some degree that's what, Losman is very curious about his own background. He's has a young son who's not seeing all that often, but who he worries about. The son has started perhaps to develop a few tics of his own, and Losman's ex-wife, or soon to be ex-wife, is kind of ignoring it, and Losman is a little bit more focused on it, obsessed with it, and sort of gets to the question of, how did my tics come about? When did my tics come about? So this whole book is dealing a lot with this idea of not only our memory, but what parts of our memory do we actually remember? Which I thought was really fascinating. And that's sort of the genesis of this drug trial.
Mm-hmm.
So have you thought about memory as a sort of an interesting driving force, to have memory, the backstory, be the engine in a way?
Yeah, for sure. In a way, I mean, when you think about novels, there are a lot of novels that utilize backstory in their narratives, and in Losman, that's pretty explicit, because there are scenes in which, and this is not giving it away, the gist of the book is that this drug trial involves a little pill that, when a subject takes it, it brings them back to their earliest childhood or babyhood memories, things that we cannot remember. And so that kind of experience is kind of common in novels, to have those backstories. But in this case, it's told in a novelistic kind of way, in which the memory is, Losman is traveling along with his childhood or babyhood self. So they're seeing the dual reality of the child and the adult together, kind of experiencing this, or re-experience this again. And so that's just kind of another way of doing a backstory in a novel.
It's very comical, because we see the adult Losman looking, for example, at the baby Losman at a birthday party, and looking up at all these strange faces who are reaching down and touching him and saying various things that one does to a baby. And you often have instances in your own life where you look back at the pictures and, do you remember the picture? Do you remember the story behind the picture? Do you remember being told the story? Did you remember experiencing it? And so that's what we're sort of exploring in Losman, is sort of, what is the nature of these memories? Are they true? And how, in what ways do they actually define the character? So Losman is sort of on this quest to do so. And he finds himself, ripping off a piece of paper on a flyer and calling somebody who shows up, two people who show up and who sort of talk very vaguely about what they plan to do with him. And Losman, very naively, I think, goes along with it. He's like, okay, yeah, I'll show up, and he gets a little nervous when they give him medicine. But it struck me as like this very curious, quirky attribute for Losman to have. He's sort of a introspective guy. He spends his time at his desk trying to march through his translating work, and all of a sudden this is sort of like his own adventure. His Don Quixote quest is going to this very strange modern building and signing papers that say, yeah, you can do what you want with me. Do you have some of that spirit of, just go off and do something crazy? Or is that where fictionalized Losman differs from K.E. Semmel?
I don't know how to answer that entirely. But I will say that I don't necessarily he's a lonely guy, as you mentioned. And I think he's really trying to get to the heart of why he does what he does. He doesn't want to be alone anymore. And he does really, truly have a great concern that his child, whom he loves dearly, has developed these tics. And I think, and you know this from your own life, you'll do anything for your kids.
Yes.
And I think for him, it's just this almost desperation. You know, he's sick of the tics in his life, and he's afraid for what it might mean for his son to develop tics. And so he sees this as an opportunity to possibly alleviate any concern and become better. And by becoming better, maybe even be able to find someone to share his life with. And I think it's partly a desperation. And I certainly don't feel that desperation. I've been very lucky in my life. My wife has been very supportive of me over the years. Wonderful. And, I've had tics, and I tell people that, for my tics are not nearly as bad as what others have dealt with. I can hide them. In other words, so like I can do things. You may be seeing some of them here, but like I can just do things that are somewhat minor and people don't see. And the same is really kind of true with Losman. But at the same time, in spite of what I say about them being mild, it's a daily nuisance. It's not a day that goes by in my life that I don't think consciously about them, and particularly in public, and not wanting to do things that are people like, well, what's he doing? Or, this constant fear that started in my own grade school experience of being kind of called out for them, and put on public display. I've never really liked that experience. Who does?
Correct.
And so I think Losman wants to find. He's desperate. He wants to find a way to not have these tics, to have a life with others, and certainly to have his son Axel free of any tics. And I will say that Kat actually does. Kat, the ex-wife, you mentioned earlier, doesn't really seem to notice or maybe care. I can't remember how you phrased it, but she does care. But I think she takes a different view of it, and that's the view that, and it's an understandable view that, by highlighting it for a little kid, it may make it worse. Right. And I appreciate that view of it as well. That who knows? At age 3, it's impossible to know, why the tics are developing and what they actually mean, because they do something to go away.
Right, and the idea that Losman, once he knows something about the origin of his own Tourette syndrome, could somehow change what he does in his life so that his son's experiences differ, or that. So it's a very interesting idea, like how much your child is like you in good ways and maybe not so good ways, in ways that will affect his or her life long term, for better or worse, and what you really can or can't do. So there's sort of this, on the one hand, Losman has this sense that he could control himself, but is also aware that the world goes on, and this magical pill may or may not be so magical, and yet he's hopeful, and he's sort of determined to break out of his apartment, so to speak, and get out in the world, and to a degree try anything, which I found to be a really admirable quality. He's an interesting guy. All of your characters are very well developed. Even you see them really well. You see what they're wearing. You see lots of details about the environment. And was it important to set this in Denmark? Like, could this book for you have been set somewhere else, or was Denmark sort of a essential part of the story?
It was for me, as a literary translator, and I've mostly lived, obviously, for the last 15, 20 years here in the States. But as a literary translator, translating from Danish, it felt to me that he needed to live in Denmark, and principally Copenhagen. But that was part of the adventure for me as a writer, because I love Copenhagen, absolutely love it. I love Denmark. I love the Danish, Danish literature and books I read in Danish. I keep reading books in Danish, even though I don't translate so much anymore at all, actually. But having it set there allowed me to do some of the fun things that I like to do when I write, and anything I write. I really want to take readers to the place where the characters are, and that, to me, that involves all the things that you see, hear, touch, taste, whatever it is, that kind of makes life interesting. Like I'm a pretty observant guy, so like if I'm sitting in a room, I can see this particular room of mine. It has yellow walls and has strange sloping ceilings, and I'm not sitting in empty space. It's something I like to call the Pocoyo effect. I don't know if you're familiar with Pocoyo.
No.
So my son, when he was about 3 or 4, we started watching this Spanish cartoon called Pocoyo, and it has an English translation. I forget who the narrator is, but it's a wonderfully fun cartoon for kids. But it's all set in a kind of a white space of nowhere, and that's fine for a cartoon. But for fiction, you can't have it set in a white space of nowhere. And so readers really want to see where a place is. I've read books before about Cuba or other places in which I feel as though I as a reader never actually visited Cuba, and I've never been to Cuba, but I want to be taken there through words. And so for the folks who have never been to Denmark or Copenhagen specifically, I want them to see this place and feel this place, and doing that through a translator's eyes, I think, is kind of cool. And also because it's an American translator, and the experience of living abroad, particularly in Denmark, where it is sometimes difficult to make new friends. They're not always, Danes are not always the most welcoming people. And I don't mean in a negative way. I'm not trying to be like, it's just a harder time. It's harder to get kind of involved in a Danish community, at least in my experience.
Culturally, some countries you can sense that right away. We were in Prague, and you got the sense when you were traveling on a bus or subway, people didn't look around or smile, and everyone talked really quietly. And if you were an American there, it felt very like you wouldn't fit in. So I imagine Copenhagen has its own cultural sensations.
For sure. And I don't mean to say that they're not nice people. I'm not saying that at all. It's a very different experience where it's, I guess it's always the sense of feeling like the other.
Right.
And, without the same cultural background. I didn't go to schools in Denmark, and I don't have those cultural reference points. So it does take some getting used to that. And I did want to, explore that sense of isolation and loneliness he would have felt in Copenhagen.
Mm-hmm. Did you go back to Copenhagen while you were writing this book for quote unquote research, or to just sort of refresh your memory?
Yeah, for sure. And my wife is Danish, and so we try to go back once a year. So I do go fairly frequently. Mm-hmm. She's from the west coast of Denmark, though, which is very different than Copenhagen. So for me, this was my chance to actually live in Copenhagen, because I've never lived in Copenhagen. This was my fictional chance to have a character who lives in Copenhagen, so that I could imagine what it's like to live in Copenhagen, which has always been a dream of mine.
May it come true sometime. You never know. So one of the things I love about this book, aside from meeting these characters and traveling with Losman throughout Copenhagen, is some of the writing. And would love to talk to you a little bit about your writing life and craft. But one of the things that I really appreciated, and I wrote down a great number of them, were some of your metaphors and similes, which, you're writing, you have this character, and on the one hand, you think it's going to be mostly about how he deals with the Tourette and this insane, absurd experiment he puts himself through, and what happens. He kind of, I'm not going to say anything detailed about it, but there's something very trippy about how he's reacting to the medicines he's being given. We'll leave it at that.
That's fine. Yes.
But I'm just going to read a few examples, and I want to just sort of understand like how you see is this how you see the world? Where do these great examples come from? You talk about a group diminishing, dissolving like antacid in water. You talk about things, we see a lot of things through Losman's eyes, including bright tufts of clouds like fat styrofoam peanuts glowing orange on the horizon. You talk about a character, I think it's the therapist, who pulls a ginger root from her shiny coffin of a fridge. I mean, to me, those are just places that I was like, wow. I just sort of stopped, highlighted them, tabbed my book. And I mean, I often talk that a writer, perhaps differently than a non-writer, sort of looks at things and these phrases just sort of come from nowhere. Is there something about the writer's mind that allows you to put those out there? Do you work hard at them, or are they coming to you organically?
Well, first of all, thank you for that. That's nice to have those words kind of talk back. I think first and foremost, a writer is a reader, and I read a lot more than I write. I can tell you that. I read generally about 3 books a day. I start off my morning with a book at 5, and I read a chapter of a book, or I read the New York Review of Books, which is a long thing to read, and so it takes me about a month to do. But I do it every day, or I read a book, and then I do an audiobook in the afternoons when I'm just making dinner or driving my car. And then in the evening, I read something else before bed. So I'm constantly reading, and what I really like about reading is that I can see how other people view the world in some way, and how they turn a phrase to allow me as a reader to see something anew. And so I guess the difference, sometimes, if you're not reading, you can see language, you can start using cliches,
Yes.
things that just kind of easily found on the tip of your brain or tip of your tongue, whatever you want to phrase that. But the more you read, the more you see that the world can be described in ways that that you never would have thought about. And so I love that. And so what I want to do always in my work is to try to think about a thing, an object, and be able to describe that in a way that is fresh and exciting.
I think you did a great job of that. 2 questions about your book reading. First, when you say you're reading 3 things a day, are you reading sequentially? So a little bit of one book, a little bit of another, and then a third one at night? Do you have a bunch of books going at once?
I do have a bunch of going at once, yeah. And I'm, I'll wherever I am in the book, it's where I read. And weirdly, I always find that they almost always end at roughly the same time. Like I always finish them around the same week, sometimes even the same day. It was like 3 books going at once. But I also work full time, so that's why I get up so early. I really love my job. I work as the communications manager of the Western New York Land Conservancy. We protect land, and that is such a thrill to do that. So it's the 2 parts of my life are literature and of course protecting the environment. So, and I get to do the communication stuff. So my strength is not necessarily in the biology or the land protection per se, but it is in describing and storytelling about that work.
And I'm going to just
go ahead.
I'm just going to put in a plug for what I still call upstate New York, which some people call Western New York these days, which is, if you think of New York State as being New York City, you are really losing out on the beauty of upstate New York. It's a gorgeous place to have grown up and to visit, and there's lots to do there. Big craft brewery scene, lots of good restaurants and literary stuff. And so just a plug for upstate New York. People somehow think it's all about, the grime of the city, and it's a completely different place. So yeah. The other question I have about your reading, can you completely immerse yourself in somebody else's work, or are you sort of always got that writer's voice going that says, how did they do that? What did they do to notice that they just that what did they do? Why did they introduce this character now? Or notice how this character all of a sudden changes here. How did I know that character was changing? Are you analyzing or are you just enjoying?
Mostly I'm enjoying. I will do the analyzing later. And there are some times when, the brain works in its own way and you can't always control how the brain thinks. But there are times when I'm reading along and like there's this change that happens. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I might want to kind of borrow that in some way later on. But generally speaking, I read for pleasure because reading is pleasurable. And if I get something out of that reading that might work in my fiction later on, then fine. But first and foremost, I'm reading for pleasure, for the sheer joy of reading. And also, honestly, I think the purpose of reading, more than anything, beyond pleasure even, is to become smarter, to view, to understand how the world works. And that's why I don't just read fiction. I'm reading nonfiction. I'm reading, I read the newspaper. I read whatever I can get my hands on. But generally speaking, I should mention that the three books are never usually the same. So I often will finish with a same genre. I mean, I'll finish the day with poetry because it's nice to go into sleep with poetry in your head.
Yes, it is.
Morning, I like to read Danish because it's nice to wake up to Danish. But that varies too. But like generally speaking, there's always a nonfiction book, a poetry book, or novel mixed into there, just because it's different ways of seeing the world. But it's usually pleasure, and it's usually about getting smarter.
I'm so seeing in one of our comments, Robin Stahl says she always has 3 books going at once: audio, ebook, and paper in hand. And I'm usually someone who has at least 2, but lately 3 or sometimes 4, depending on what we're prepping for the show. So for those of you who are joining late, welcome. I'm talking to K.E. Semmel about his book, The Book of Losman, which came out this week and is a wonderful read. It is not all that long. You can sit and read it in an afternoon if you're a fast reader, but you won't want to go that fast because there's so much to linger over in terms of beautiful language and plot development and character development, and to enjoy your visit to Copenhagen. I certainly felt I didn't want to give up on all that scenery and geography and the foods and whatnot. So you say you're not working as a translator any longer. How long did you work as a translator? How did you get into it? Did you study Danish in school? How did that all come about?
So I don't do it anymore. That's correct. I did it for about 15 years, but the reason I'm not doing it anymore is twofold. I have this full-time job that I really love, and I want to devote time to doing that, but also because I want now, especially, to actually focus on my own work. It's a wonderful thing to translate and to be able to translate, but it does take time away from your own work. That being the fiction that I like to write, especially when you have a full-time job. There was a time in my life when I was writing one of my previous manuscripts where I would wake up at 4 a.m. to write on this book for 1 hour, and then I had a translation job, and I would work on that for 2 hours, and then I would have breakfast with my wife and young son, and then I would go to work for a different job then, but I would go to work until like 5, and then I would come home, and I was exhausted. And you can't live like that for very long. And now that I'm, almost 50, it's hard to say, but I also, I don't want to do that anymore. And that's the chief reason. Now, I got into it because I studied literature and history in college, and then I really wanted to learn German because my father's influence, and I wanted to learn German, and so I studied German, and then in graduate school out in Kansas, I met my wife, who was Danish, and we we lived together in Denmark, and that's because I had the English, native English, and then learned German. I felt there was a nice mix there that, it's fairly quickly that I learned Danish from those two experiences, but those two languages, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I always hear people talk about the getting up at 5 a.m. to write. Is that something you are still doing, early morning writing? And is that like a prerequisite to being a writer, that you have to be able to set your alarm and get out of bed and get moving?
Every writer is different. Some writers write at night, some write in the afternoon, some find snatches of time during the day to write while their kids are eating lunch or whatever. Everyone's different. And I just know for me, I tend to be a fairly regimented person,
Mm-hmm.
and doing it in this order makes a lot of sense for me. But everyone has a different way of doing it. It's just my particular way is to get up early in the morning and work on it for about an hour at least. I'll be honest though, I haven't written anything new fiction wise in some time, and just getting this book and getting it ready for, the whole editorial process. It was about 2 years with SFWP, the press. And then of course you're trying to write some pieces that will help promote the book, I guess. So there's a lot that goes into it, and so I'm looking forward to writing another piece of fiction soon. But I haven't in a while.
Do you expect to write another book? Do you want to write some short stories, or do you have things in mind?
Yeah, I do have a great idea in mind, and but I always have some great ideas, and I always have like a stockpile in my head of ideas, and I figure that the ones that stick with me the longest, I will write. So like I'll think of things, I don't write them down, and if I keep thinking about it, and I write, the way I write is initially it's very much scenic in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't generally take notes on ideas, but I'll just kind of play with them and just create scenes in my head. And sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's months. And in the case of Losman, it was an idea that turned into something. The idea of the pill has long been with me, and I didn't have anything to make a story out of that idea until basically I was officially diagnosed with Tourette. Then I realized there was something I could do.
And you talk in the acknowledgments a bit about being diagnosed later in life, and whereas Losman, you get the sense, has known for quite some time. Was that a relief to you as a writer to know what was going on? Had your parents or family talked about it, or was it just something that was part of who you were and how you moved?
It certainly was a relief to me as a person. I can't say necessarily it impacted my writing in any sort of way. It wasn't something that we talked about necessarily, and at least not in my recollection. I always had a suspicion that this was possibly what was happening. But there's no one else in my family who has anything like this. And so for the longest time, just kind of, as you saw in the HuffPost piece, that was extremely wide. It was read by a lot of people. And the first day alone, there were 500,000 views on the.
Wow, that's incredible.
It was massive, and I got so many emails. And
let's hope all of those people go out and buy your book.
Well,
wouldn't that be great?
I guess, yeah, it'd be great, sure. But that was published in April. So I think it allowed me for me as a person to kind of start rethinking everything in terms of these tics and what they really mean. And the one thing it has done is to really prod me forward into maybe being more vocal about the tics and what it means, and maybe for others who have tics and people with Tourette, and doing some more for Tourette for others as well. one of the things that was the big takeaway from that article was the number of people who wrote to me who had similar experiences, but also grew up at a time like I did when nobody talked about it.
Right.
And so that was really affirming. But there were also parents of kids with Tourette, or with tics at least, who were actually apologetic, because now when they read my piece, a couple in particular were like, "Well, wow, my son has these tics, and I always just tell him to stop, but maybe he can't help himself." And that's, that was my experience too. That's my experience with a teacher. Was like, yeah, I can't actually, I suppose, but it hurts, or it's not hurt so much, but it's like, it's not easy to do. I can't actually stop it. And
right, and you explore a lot of that in your book. So I imagine some of what you learned as an adult then informed your character and how
correct,
he is dealing with it and trying to come to terms with it.
correct, yeah.
So I know this is your first published book, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the writing process, how long this one took, and what, if anything, came before Losman.
Yeah, so this the first draft of this probably took about a year, I think, and then a second draft took another year.
Were there a lot of changes between the drafts, or was it mostly tightening or expanding?
A lot of tightening, a lot of expanding, and a lot of shrinking. So things would be added, things would be removed, things would be added again in a different way, and then removed again. So I think an early draft was about 80,000 words. This ended up being about 60,000 in the end. It included 3 fairy tales in the first version,
interesting.
which one reader suggested that, that those may have been too jarring a contrast to what the rest of the book was, and I thought about that, and I ended up agreeing that those probably belonged on their own. So I there's a reference to the fairy tales that Losman tells Axel, and
Right.
those were the fairy tales. I actually tried to put them in there in an earlier
Right.
draft, but just
Right.
I didn't think they worked as well. And they do cut down the flow of the narrative. I wanted to kind of be propelled and move forward at a reasonably fast pace. And every time you do that, it does jar. And so I decided that it jarred too much that I wouldn't use it.
Okay. So I understand from Trisha, we have some questions from our audience for K.E. Semmel. Robin Stull asks, who joined late in the conversation. Her question is, in which language do you think in while you are writing, and in which language do you dream?
Definitely English. I'm not a native Dane. If I had lived there, if I still lived there, then yes, maybe I would dream and think in Danish. There are times when I do create scenes in Danish, and that those are deliberate, and I will try to do it in Danish.
Why does that help you?
Well, in a case like Losman, I mean, the book is set in Denmark, and I did want the characters to sound Danish in their way. I mean, it's English. I mean, it's I blend in Danish words, but I also wanted them to think like a Dane might think. And a perfect example is Axel. He's somebody who speaks only in Danish, but Losman then translates immediately what he has said, so we know what he said. But he is a 3-year-old kid, and so it didn't make sense from the writer's perspective to have him say things that were in English when
Right.
a little kid has a 3-year-old language is not complex. So I wanted to make sure that he was speaking in Danish, because that's I have friends who have kids in Denmark who their kids, even though they're Americans, their kids who are half Danish, half American, they spoke Danish. They spoke the language that was dominant. And our son, he speaks English. He speaks the language that is dominant. He understands Danish, but he won't speak it. Much to my chagrin.
Maybe when you take him to Copenhagen, he will.
He will, yeah, and he'll pick it up again quickly, I guess. He's not exactly your most outgoing, and he may not speak it regularly, but he could easily pick it up, and he will pronounce words better than I do. Yeah, because it's a difficult language to pronounce, and so there are words that I struggle with even today.
I'm sure. Are there other questions, Tricia? Is it a challenge to preserve the author's voice and tone when translating from one language to another?
Yes.
Well, I know we have a mutual friend. We have actually a couple mutual friends who are translators who talk about that it's not, you're not making a verbatim translation, that translating work is a lot more creative than, for example, if you were sitting at the UN and doing a live translation of a speech, that there's much more to it when you're doing a book or an article.
Yeah, and it is difficult. It's one of probably the most difficult things. And I that's Idra Novi, I'm thinking you're talking about there. Okay. Yeah, it is definitely not a word for word verbatim translation. And you are trying, I think the most important thing is to to find that tone and that voice and match it as best you can. And sometimes that means finding a tone and a voice in English that is unique. So it definitely is a challenge, and the biggest challenge, I think.
And last question before we have to wrap up, how do you think your work as a translator affected your writing as an American author? Not so much around your character development and your character is, but just sort of that language sensibility.
Yeah, I wrote about this for the Millions. I think it means a lot. Being a translator means that you're deeply involved with language to the level of sentence, to the level of word, to the level of letter even. And so you are constantly revising and constantly thinking about how to do it better. And in particular, there's one translator named Bruna Dantas Labato who talks about how language, I'm going to forget exactly what she said. But I can't remember exactly what she said. But language is a constant battle in a sense. And so as a translator, you're constantly at work on it. It's like clay at that level. You're just shaping it. And I think doing that in from one language to another. Oh, I remember now. All the different voices. This is what Bruna said. All the different voices that you as a translator have to work with. It actually helps you. You experience these voices. You experience how others do it, and you realize that you can do that too. And I think that's part of what makes being a translator so amazing for a writer. You get to practice on all these different voices, and you get to do all these different things. You get to learn how to edit. You get to learn how to revise, and it's hugely important.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kyle. I've been talking to K.E. Semmel, the author of the Book of Losman, which came out this week. It's a beautiful, funny, insightful read, and I encourage all of Blaze Nation to go get it. You can find it at your favorite indie bookstore. You can go to our favorite, bookshop.org online, which supports all sorts of independent bookstores and book programs like ours. So please make a point of going out and buying this book. We will be back on Debut Spotlight in November, right after the election, talking to Morgan J. Talty, whose book Fire Exit came out this spring. And we will be doing it in the fall when it is Native American Heritage Month. Until then, keep reading. And what's most important, go blaze that vote. Have a great day, everyone.